The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I pushed my cleaning cart down the marble hallway of Blackstone and Associates at 6 in the morning. My blue uniform rustled softly as I approached the corner office belonging to Madison Brooks, Senior Marketing Director. I figured I had plenty of time to empty her trash before anyone arrived. Wrong. The elevator dinged and Madison's heels clicked against the floor like gunshots. She spotted me near her mahogany desk, and her face twisted with disgust. "What are you doing touching my workspace?" she snapped, glaring at my custodial uniform. "People like you need to learn your place. Janitors will never amount to anything important." I stood there silently, letting her words wash over me. What Madison didn't know was that she was speaking to someone with a master's in business administration. Standing there in that sterile office, absorbing Madison's venomous words, my mind drifted back to how I ended up here. 6 months ago, I was Erica Thompson's strategic planning manager at Sterling Communications. I had a corner office, a company car, and a salary that let me live comfortably in downtown Seattle. Then the budget cuts came like a tsunami. 30% of the workforce vanished overnight, and despite my excellent performance reviews and advanced degree, I became another casualty of corporate restructuring. For weeks, I sent out resumes and attended interviews. The responses were always the same: polite rejections or silence. My savings dwindled as rent, student loans, and basic expenses consumed what little I had left. When Pacific Cleaning Services offered me the overnight custodial position at Blackstone and Associates, I swallowed my pride and took it. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but it kept me afloat while I continued searching for something in my field. What I discovered during those quiet midnight hours was something I never expected. Corporate offices reveal their secrets when they think nobody important is watching. I witnessed confidential meetings that ran late, overheard phone calls discussing questionable business practices, and saw documents left carelessly on desks that painted a picture of systematic corruption. Madison continued her tirade, unaware that I was mentally cataloging every word. "I've worked too hard to get where I am to have someone like you contaminating my space," she declared, gesturing dismissively at my cleaning supplies. "Interns and janitors are interchangeable nobodies. You'll spend your whole life emptying trash cans while successful people like me make decisions that matter." As she spoke, I noticed her computer screen was still active from the previous evening. Spreadsheets displayed data that immediately caught my trained eye. The numbers didn't align with the quarterly reports I had seen posted in the lobby. Revenue figures appeared inflated, and expense categories seemed deliberately miscategorized. My MBA coursework in financial analysis kicked in automatically as I processed what I was seeing. Madison grabbed her coffee mug and headed toward the break room, still muttering about keeping the help in line. She left her office door open, and I continued my cleaning routine while observing her workspace more carefully. Her desk contained multiple client folders spread open, revealing contracts with companies like Pinnacle Tech, Morrison Industries, and Coastal Retail Group. The financial projections in these folders showed dramatically different numbers than what appeared on her computer screen. When Madison returned with her assistant Chelsea, I pretended to focus on emptying the wastebasket while listening to their conversation. "The Pinnacle account is generating even more profit than we projected," Madison bragged, settling into her leather chair. "My creative accounting methods have been brilliant. We're skimming just enough to boost our quarterly bonuses without triggering any red flags." Chelsea shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Are you sure the clients won't notice the discrepancies in their billing statements?" she asked nervously. Madison laughed coldly. "Those corporate dinosaurs barely read their invoices. They trust us to manage their marketing budgets while they focus on their own operations. By the time anyone notices irregular patterns, if they ever do, I'll have moved on to a better position with a stellar track record of exceeding profit margins." I continued cleaning methodically, my hands working automatically while my brain absorbed every detail of their conversation. Madison was describing a sophisticated embezzlement scheme that involved manipulating client accounts to generate unauthorized profits that she then diverted into performance bonuses for herself and select accomplices. As I moved to dust the bookshelf behind Madison's desk, I accidentally knocked over her coffee mug with my elbow. The ceramic cup shattered against the floor, sending coffee splashing across the carpet and under her desk. "You clumsy idiot!" Madison shrieked, jumping up from her chair. "Clean that mess up immediately!" I dropped to my knees with paper towels, apologizing profusely while Madison continued berating me about the incompetence of cleaning staff. As I reached under her desk to wipe up the spilled coffee, my fingers brushed against something small and rectangular taped to the underside of the desk drawer. It was a USB drive carefully hidden where nobody would think to look. Madison was so focused on documenting the damage to her carpet for a complaint against the cleaning service that she never noticed me carefully detaching the USB drive and slipping it into my pocket. She stood over me, arms crossed, as I finished cleaning the coffee stain. "This is exactly why people like you will never succeed," she declared. "You can't even perform simple tasks without causing problems." I apologized again, gathered my cleaning supplies, and moved on to the next office. But my heart was racing with the realization that I now possessed what could be crucial evidence of Madison's criminal activities. The USB drive felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket as I completed the rest of my shift, my mind racing with possibilities and implications of what I had discovered. The next evening, I arrived at work with a new sense of purpose. I had spent the entire day analyzing the contents of Madison's USB drive on my personal laptop, and what I found was even worse than I had initially suspected. The drive contained backup files of falsified financial reports, client billing records that had been systematically altered, and email correspondence detailing the elaborate fraud scheme Madison had been operating for over 2 years. The scope of her embezzlement was staggering. She had created fake vendor accounts under names like Meridian Consulting Solutions and Strategic Marketing Partners that existed only on paper. Client payments were being split with legitimate portions going to actual services, while the remainder was diverted to these phantom companies that Madison controlled. The total amount stolen was approaching $500,000 across 3 major accounts. As I pushed my cleaning cart through the corridors of Blackstone and Associates that night, I wasn't just a janitor anymore. I was a detective gathering intelligence on a criminal operation that was robbing innocent clients and enriching Madison at their expense. Every conversation I overheard, every document left on a desk, every late-night phone call became a potential piece of evidence in building a case against her. My first priority was understanding exactly how the scheme worked and who else might be involved. Madison couldn't be operating this sophisticated fraud entirely alone. She needed accomplices within the company who could process false invoices, authorize fraudulent payments, and help cover her tracks when questions arose. During my cleaning rounds, I paid special attention to the offices of employees who worked closely with Madison. Her assistant Chelsea seemed nervous and uncomfortable whenever financial matters came up in conversations. The accounting department's junior associates often worked late, and I began noticing they frequently handled paperwork related to the same client accounts that Madison was manipulating. On Wednesday night, I witnessed a disturbing scene that revealed the human cost of Madison's criminal behavior. Sarah Miller, a 22-year-old intern from the University of Washington, was working late in the conference room when Madison cornered her with a stack of documents. I was cleaning the adjacent hallway and could hear their conversation through the thin walls. "I need you to process these revised billing statements for the Pinnacle account," Madison commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. "The amounts have been adjusted to reflect additional services we provided last quarter," Sarah's voice was shaky as she responded. "But Madison, I don't understand why these numbers are different from the original invoices. The services described here weren't mentioned in any of the project documentation I've seen." Madison's laugh was sharp and intimidating. "That's not your job to understand, Sarah. Your job is to process the paperwork I give you and learn how business really works. If you want a permanent position here after graduation, you'll do exactly what I tell you without questioning my decisions." The threat was clear and cruel. Sarah was a scholarship student trying to build a career foundation, and Madison was exploiting her vulnerable position to force participation in illegal activities. I watched through the glass partition as Sarah reluctantly signed the falsified documents, her hands trembling as she processed invoices that she clearly knew were fraudulent. This interaction revealed another layer of Madison's criminal enterprise. She wasn't just stealing money, she was coercing young employees to become unwilling accomplices by threatening their career prospects. Sarah and others like her were being manipulated into participating in crimes they barely understood, while Madison protected herself by ensuring that other people's signatures appeared on the fraudulent documents. Over the following nights, I developed a systematic approach to gathering evidence. I used my access to empty offices and conference rooms to photograph documents, record conversations when possible, and map out the network of people involved in Madison's scheme. My MBA training proved invaluable in understanding the financial mechanisms she was using and identifying the weakest points in her operation. I also began researching Madison's background and career history. What I discovered was a pattern of suspicious behavior at her previous employers. She had left 2 other marketing firms under questionable circumstances, and both companies had experienced unexplained financial discrepancies during her tenure. Madison wasn't just an opportunistic criminal. She was a serial offender who had been perfecting her fraud techniques for years. On Friday night, everything changed when I overheard a phone conversation that chilled me to the bone. Madison was in her office after hours speaking to someone she called Marcus. I was cleaning the office next door when her voice rose loud enough for me to hear clearly through the shared wall. "The Richardson problem needs to be handled next week," Madison was saying. "I've been planting evidence in David's files for months. The audit trail points directly to him approving all the suspicious transactions." David Richardson was Blackstone's chief financial officer, a respected executive with 20 years at the company and an impeccable reputation. I had seen him working late many nights, often looking stressed and exhausted. Now I understood why. Madison was systematically framing him for her crimes. "Once the investigation starts, David will be arrested within 72 hours, Madison continued. "His access to the financial systems makes him the perfect scapegoat. Everyone will believe that a desperate CFO with mounting personal expenses would be tempted to embezzle company funds." My blood ran cold as I realized the full scope of Madison's plan. She wasn't just stealing money, she was preparing to destroy an innocent man's life and career to cover her tracks. David Richardson would face criminal charges, prison time, and the complete destruction of his professional reputation, all while Madison walked away clean with hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars. I knew I had to act quickly. David's life was about to be ruined, and Madison's scheme was approaching its final phase. The evidence I had gathered was substantial, but I needed to be strategic about how to expose her without putting myself or other innocent employees at risk. Madison had proven she was willing to destroy anyone who threatened her criminal enterprise, and I couldn't underestimate how dangerous she might become when cornered. The weekend passed in a blur of anxiety and planning. I knew that David Richardson was walking into a trap, unaware that his professional destruction was being orchestrated by someone he trusted. On Monday morning before my shift began, I drove past David's suburban home in Bellevue and saw him loading his daughter's wheelchair into their van. The sight hit me like a physical blow. I had learned through overheard conversations that David's 12-year-old daughter, Emma, had been diagnosed with a rare form of muscular dystrophy that required expensive experimental treatments not covered by insurance. David had been working extra hours and taking on consulting projects to pay for her medical care. The stress was visible on his face, and now I understood why Madison had chosen him as her scapegoat. A desperate father facing crushing medical bills would be the perfect suspect for embezzlement charges. That evening at work, Madison's behavior had shifted into overdrive. She prowled the corridors like a predator, sensing blood snapping at employees and demanding instant compliance with increasingly unreasonable requests. When I entered her office to empty the trash, she watched my every movement with suspicious eyes. "You!" she barked, pointing at me with a manicured finger. "Work faster! I don't have time to watch you dawdle around my office all night. And stay away from my desk. Cleaning staff has no business being anywhere near confidential documents." I nodded submissively while noting that Madison had installed a small security camera on her bookshelf that hadn't been there the previous week. She was becoming paranoid, which meant my investigation was approaching a critical phase. Paranoid criminals make dangerous mistakes, but they also become more vicious when threatened. As I moved through the building that night, I noticed other changes that indicated Madison was tightening security around her operation. She had started locking her office door when she left, requiring me to request access from building security. The fake vendor files had been moved from her desk to a locked filing cabinet. Most concerning, she had begun staying late several nights each week working when she thought the building was empty except for cleaning staff. On Tuesday night, I discovered just how far Madison's surveillance capabilities extended. While cleaning the IT department, I found printed emails that revealed Madison had been monitoring all employee communications through spyware installed on company computers. The software logged keystrokes, captured screenshots, and recorded audio through computer microphones without employee knowledge or consent. The violations of privacy were staggering. Madison had recordings of private conversations between employees discussing personal problems, financial difficulties, and family issues. David Richardson's emails to specialists about his daughter's treatment were printed and highlighted. Sarah Miller's conversations with her roommate about student loan payments were transcribed and annotated. Madison was building psychological profiles of her coworkers to identify vulnerabilities she could exploit. But the most disturbing discovery was a folder labeled Insurance Policies that contained detailed blackmail material on key employees. Madison had compiled compromising information about personal relationships, financial struggles, and professional mistakes that she could use to ensure silence and compliance. Anyone who threatened to expose her criminal activities would face the destruction of their personal reputation and career prospects. I realized that Madison wasn't just running an embezzlement scheme. She was operating a criminal enterprise based on surveillance blackmail and psychological manipulation. Her victims weren't just the clients being robbed, but every employee whose privacy she had violated and whose trust she was exploiting. Wednesday night brought new horrors when I witnessed Madison's cruelty firsthand. I was cleaning the conference room when she cornered Sarah Miller again, this time with a laptop displaying audio recordings of Sarah's private phone calls. "I have recordings of you talking about your student loans and your family's financial problems," Madison said with cold satisfaction. "I know your parents mortgaged their house to help pay for your education, and I know you're desperate to land a permanent job here to start paying them back." Sarah's face went pale as she realized the extent of Madison's surveillance. "You've been recording my personal conversations," she whispered, her voice breaking with betrayal and fear. Madison smiled like a shark circling wounded prey. "I protect this company's interests by knowing everything about the people who work here. Now I need you to process these additional billing adjustments for the Morrison account. The amounts are significant, but they reflect services that were definitely provided. Sarah looked at the documents with tears in her eyes. The falsified invoices totaled over $50,000, representing Madison's largest single theft to date. Madison, I can't do this. These charges aren't legitimate, and I could lose my accounting certification if I'm caught processing fraudulent billing. Madison's expression turned vicious. You'll lose much more than your certification if you don't cooperate. I'll make sure you never work in accounting anywhere in Seattle. I'll destroy your references, contact your professors, and ensure that your parents' financial sacrifices for your education become completely worthless. Your choice is simple: process these invoices or watch your entire future crumble. I watched Sarah's shoulders sag in defeat as she realized she was trapped. Madison had studied her psychological vulnerabilities and crafted threats specifically designed to force compliance. The young woman signed the fraudulent documents with shaking hands, while Madison watched with obvious satisfaction. That night, as I finished my cleaning rounds, I made a decision that would change everything. Madison's criminal enterprise had grown beyond simple theft into a systematic operation that destroyed innocent people's lives. David Richardson was about to be framed for crimes he didn't commit. Sarah Miller and other young employees were being coerced into criminal activity that could ruin their futures. The clients being robbed trusted Blackstone and Associates with their marketing budgets and had no idea they were being systematically cheated. Madison had to be stopped, but I needed irrefutable evidence that would expose her crimes without giving her the opportunity to destroy more lives in the process. Her surveillance capabilities and willingness to blackmail innocent people made her extremely dangerous. I couldn't simply hand my evidence to company management or law enforcement without ensuring that Madison couldn't retaliate against her victims or escape accountability. As I prepared to leave that night, I noticed a black sedan in the parking garage that hadn't been there when I arrived. Through the tinted windows, I could see the silhouette of someone watching the building. Madison's operation was larger than I had realized, and she had allies who might be equally dangerous. The stakes had risen beyond anything I had imagined, and I was about to discover just how far Madison would go to protect her criminal empire. The following evening, I arrived at work with a small recording device hidden in my cleaning supplies. I had spent the entire day researching surveillance techniques and evidence-gathering methods that would hold up in court. If I was going to expose Madison's criminal empire, I needed recordings of her admitting to specific crimes that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay or misunderstandings. My opportunity came when Madison scheduled a late meeting with someone she called Marcus, who I suspected was her accomplice at the accounting firm that handled Blackstone's external audits. I had seen references to Marcus in her encrypted files, but I needed to identify him and understand his role in the embezzlement scheme. At 9:30 that evening, a silver Lexus pulled into the executive parking area. A tall man in an expensive suit emerged and entered the building using a security card that shouldn't have existed. The fact that Madison had provided unauthorized access to an outsider confirmed that her operation involved people beyond Blackstone's walls. I positioned myself in the supply closet adjacent to Madison's office, where I could hear conversations through the shared ventilation system. My recording device was activated and hidden among my cleaning supplies, ready to capture evidence of their criminal conspiracy. Marcus turned out to be Marcus Webb, a partner at Hartwell and Associates, the accounting firm that conducted Blackstone's quarterly audits. His role in Madison's scheme was to manipulate audit reports and ensure that stolen funds were never detected during external reviews. In exchange, Madison paid him $25,000 for each successful audit that concealed her embezzlement activities. The Richardson setup is proceeding perfectly, Madison reported with obvious satisfaction. I've planted enough evidence to make him look guilty of every theft we've committed over the past 2 years. The revised audit trail shows him authorizing suspicious transactions, approving fake vendor payments, and accessing client accounts outside normal business hours. Marcus reviewed documents on Madison's laptop while I recorded every word of their conversation. The beauty of framing the CFO is that everyone will believe he had both the access and the motivation to steal, he observed. His daughter's medical expenses provide the perfect motive, and his executive privileges eliminate questions about how he could manipulate the financial systems. They spent the next hour reviewing their plan to trigger the investigation that would destroy David Richardson's life. Marcus had prepared a false audit report that would be submitted to Blackstone's board of directors, highlighting suspicious financial activities that pointed directly to David as the perpetrator. Once the report was filed, law enforcement would be notified within 48 hours. But I also learned something that chilled me to the bone. Madison and Marcus weren't just planning to frame David for embezzlement. They were preparing to eliminate anyone who might threaten their operation. The cleaning woman has been acting suspicious lately, Madison mentioned casually. She's been in my office more frequently, and I've noticed small changes in how my documents are arranged. Marcus leaned forward with interest. How do you want to handle the situation? Madison's smile was predatory. I've prepared a simple solution. Tomorrow night I'll plant drugs in her cleaning cart and call security. Once she's arrested for possession, her credibility as a potential witness will be completely destroyed. No one believes the testimony of a drug-addicted criminal. My heart raced as I realized that Madison had identified me as a threat and was planning to frame me for drug possession. She had no idea about my true background or the evidence I had gathered, but her instincts told her I was dangerous to her operation. The trap she was setting would not only destroy my reputation, but also eliminate any possibility of exposing her crimes. I continued recording as Madison and Marcus discussed their timeline for framing David Richardson and eliminating potential witnesses. They planned to submit the false audit report on Friday morning, triggering an investigation that would culminate in David's arrest by Monday. My own destruction was scheduled for Thursday night, ensuring that I would be in jail and discredited before David's life was ruined. After Marcus left, Madison remained in her office making phone calls to coordinate the final phase of her plan. I heard her speaking to someone about purchasing illegal drugs that could be planted as evidence and arranging for security guards who would be susceptible to bribes in exchange for testifying about my suspicious behavior. As I processed what I had learned, the full scope of Madison's criminal enterprise became clear. She wasn't just an embezzler. She was the leader of a sophisticated criminal organization that included accomplices at accounting firms, security companies, and potentially law enforcement agencies. Her willingness to frame innocent people for serious crimes demonstrated a level of ruthlessness that made her extremely dangerous. I spent the rest of my shift documenting everything I had observed and recorded, uploading backup copies of all evidence to secure cloud storage that Madison couldn't access or destroy. I also prepared detailed written statements describing her criminal activities, her accomplices, and her plans to frame both David Richardson and myself. But I faced an impossible dilemma. If I went to the police immediately, Madison might discover my betrayal and accelerate her timeline for destroying her victims. If I waited too long, David would be arrested and I would be framed for drug possession, eliminating both of us as threats to her operation. I needed a strategy that would expose her crimes while protecting all of her intended victims. As I prepared to leave that night, I noticed the same black sedan in the parking garage, confirming my suspicion that Madison had surveillance teams monitoring potential threats. Her criminal organization was larger and more sophisticated than I had initially realized, and she had resources that could make her extremely dangerous to anyone who tried to expose her activities. I drove home knowing that the next 24 hours would determine whether justice would be served or whether Madison's criminal empire would claim several more innocent victims. The trap was set, but I was no longer sure who was the hunter and who was the prey. Thursday evening arrived with the weight of inevitability. I knew Madison was planning to plant drugs in my cleaning cart and have me arrested, destroying my credibility as a witness while eliminating a perceived threat to her criminal operation. But I had spent the entire day preparing a counterattack that would turn her own trap against her. I arrived at work carrying my usual cleaning supplies, but this time I had a digital recording device hidden in my uniform that would capture everything that happened during my shift. I also had backup copies of all evidence secured with attorneys and law enforcement contacts who would receive the materials automatically if I failed to check in by midnight. Madison was waiting for me when I entered the building, her smile cold and predatory as she watched me push my cleaning cart toward the service elevator. She had positioned herself near the security desk, ready to trigger the trap that would destroy my life and eliminate me as a threat to her criminal enterprise. I began my cleaning rounds, normally moving through the building while maintaining the appearance of a routine work shift. But I was actually implementing a carefully planned strategy to expose Madison's crimes while protecting myself from her false accusations. Every conversation was being recorded, and every action was being documented in real time. At 9:15, Madison approached my cleaning cart with exaggerated concern, claiming she had noticed suspicious behavior and requesting that security search my supplies for contraband. The head of security, a man named Frank Morrison, who had clearly been bribed to participate in Madison's scheme, agreed to conduct an immediate search of my cart and personal belongings. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding," Madison said with false sympathy as Frank began searching through my cleaning supplies. "But we have to protect the company from potential liability if employees are using illegal substances on company property." Frank's search quickly revealed a small plastic bag of white powder that Madison had planted in my cart earlier that evening. He held up the evidence with theatrical shock, declaring that he had found what appeared to be cocaine hidden among my cleaning chemicals. Madison gasped with perfectly rehearsed surprise, expressing dismay that such a trusted employee would betray the company's confidence. But I was ready for this moment. "I want to make a statement before you call the police," I said calmly, pulling out my recording device and my business credentials. "My name is Erica Thompson, and I have a master's degree in business administration from the University of Washington. I've been working undercover as a custodial employee while investigating financial crimes at this company." Madison's face went pale as she realized her trap was backfiring spectacularly. Frank Morrison looked confused, uncertain whether to continue with the planned false arrest or listen to my unexpected revelation. I handed him copies of my educational certificates and my previous employment records, proving that I wasn't the uneducated janitor Madison had assumed. "For the past 6 weeks, I've been documenting systematic embezzlement, fraud, and blackmail activities orchestrated by Madison Brooks." I continued producing printed copies of the evidence I had gathered. "Madison has stolen nearly $500,000 from client accounts, and she's planning to frame David Richardson for her crimes." Madison's composure cracked completely as she realized her carefully constructed plan was unraveling. "This is ridiculous," she stammered, her voice rising with panic. "She's obviously lying to avoid drug charges. You can't trust anything a criminal says to protect herself." But Frank Morrison was examining my evidence with growing alarm, recognizing the sophistication of the financial analysis I had prepared. The forged documents, the falsified audit reports, and the recordings of Madison's conversations with Marcus Webb painted a clear picture of criminal conspiracy that went far beyond simple drug possession. "Madison, these documents appear to show systematic theft from company accounts," Frank said slowly, his allegiance to her bribery scheme wavering as he realized the magnitude of what he was seeing. "If these allegations are true, We're talking about federal crimes that would result in serious prison time. Madison's panic escalated as she recognized that her attempt to frame me was instead exposing her own criminal activities. In her desperation, she made a crucial mistake that sealed her fate forever. "You don't understand!" Madison blurted out, her professional facade collapsing under pressure. "The Richardson plan was supposed to work perfectly. We planted everything to make him look guilty of the embezzlement. Marcus promised the audit would be clean if I just eliminated the potential witnesses who might cause problems." Frank Morrison's eyes widened as Madison accidentally confessed to framing David Richardson and conspiring with external accomplices. Her own words were providing evidence of criminal conspiracy fraud and obstruction of justice that would be impossible to deny or explain away. I continued recording as Madison desperately tried to backtrack from her accidental confession, but the damage was already done. She had confirmed my allegations about framing David Richardson working with Marcus Webb at the accounting firm and planning to eliminate witnesses who threatened her operation. At that moment, my phone buzzed with an urgent text message from an unknown number. "FBI investigating accounting irregularities. Marcus Webb arrested 1 hour ago. Recommend immediate cooperation with federal authorities." Madison saw my expression change as I read the message, and her face went white with terror. "Marcus was arrested," she whispered, realizing that her entire criminal network was collapsing simultaneously. Frank Morrison was now in a state of shock, understanding that he had been manipulated into participating in a federal criminal conspiracy that could result in his own prosecution. The bribery payments Madison had made to ensure his cooperation in framing me were suddenly evidence of his own criminal liability. "I think we need to call the FBI immediately," Frank said, reaching for his phone with shaking hands. "This situation is far beyond anything local security can handle." Madison made one final desperate attempt to escape accountability. "Everything Erica is saying is fabricated," she declared, her voice cracking with desperation. "She's a disgruntled employee who was fired from her previous job and is seeking revenge against successful people. You can't believe anything she says." But her lies were contradicted by the evidence I had meticulously gathered over 6 weeks of investigation. The recordings of her conversations with Marcus Webb, the falsified financial documents, and the detailed analysis of her embezzlement scheme provided irrefutable proof of her criminal activities. As Frank Morrison dialed the FBI's field office in Seattle, I realized that Madison's own arrogance and cruelty had ultimately caused her downfall. Her assumption that I was just an ignorant janitor had led her to conduct criminal activities in front of someone who possessed the education and expertise to understand exactly what she was doing. The tables had turned completely. Madison's trap had become her confession, and her attempt to destroy an innocent witness had instead provided the final evidence needed to ensure her prosecution for federal crimes. Justice was finally within reach. Within 2 hours, the Blackstone and Associates building had been transformed into a federal crime scene. FBI agents in dark suits moved through the corridors securing evidence and interviewing employees who had worked late. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, a seasoned white-collar crime investigator, had taken charge of the operation based on the evidence I provided and the arrest of Marcus Webb earlier that evening. Madison sat in the conference room under federal custody, her arrogance finally shattered as she faced the reality of her situation. The sophisticated criminal empire she had built over 2 years was crumbling around her as investigators uncovered the full scope of her embezzlement fraud and blackmail activities. "Ms. Thompson, your undercover investigation has provided crucial evidence in what appears to be a sophisticated criminal conspiracy," Agent Walsh explained as she reviewed my documentation. The recordings you made of Madison Brooks discussing her plans to frame David Richardson constitute clear evidence of obstruction of justice and criminal conspiracy. I felt a mixture of relief and vindication as federal agents validated the evidence I had risked everything to gather. The USB drive I had discovered, the financial analysis I had prepared, and the recordings of Madison's conversations with Marcus Webb provided an airtight case that would be impossible for her to deny or escape. David Richardson arrived at the building shortly after midnight, summoned by FBI agents who needed to interview him about his potential victimization in Madison's scheme. His confusion turned to shock as investigators explained how Madison had been systematically framing him for crimes she had committed herself. "She planted evidence in my files to make me look guilty of embezzlement," David asked incredulously, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and relief. "I've been wondering why my computer access logs showed activities I never performed. I thought there might be a technical glitch in the system." Agent Walsh confirmed that Madison had been using David's executive credentials to authorize fraudulent transactions, creating a false trail of evidence that would have resulted in his arrest and prosecution for crimes he never committed. The medical expenses for his daughter Emma had provided the perfect motive that would have convinced a jury of his guilt. "Without Ms. Thompson's investigation, you would have been arrested within 48 hours. Agent Walsh explained. "Madison Brooks had prepared a comprehensive false case against you that included forged audit reports, manipulated computer logs, and fabricated evidence of financial desperation." Sarah Miller and several other young employees were also interviewed by federal agents who discovered the extent of Madison's psychological manipulation and coercion. The blackmail material Madison had compiled using illegal surveillance was being used to force innocent employees to participate in criminal activities they barely understood. "I knew the invoices were fraudulent, but Madison threatened to destroy my career if I didn't process them," Sarah explained through tears of relief and shame. "She recorded my private conversations and knew about my family's financial problems. I felt like I had no choice but to cooperate with her demands." The FBI agents assured Sarah and the other coerced employees that they were victims of Madison's criminal enterprise rather than willing participants. Their cooperation with investigators would be taken into account, and they would receive protection from retaliation as federal witnesses in the prosecution case. As the investigation continued through the night, the full scope of Madison's criminal activities became clear. She had stolen over $600,000 from client accounts over 2 years, using sophisticated money laundering techniques to hide the theft. Her accomplices included Marcus Webb at the accounting firm Corrupt Security Personnel and a network of fake businesses designed to facilitate the embezzlement scheme. But Madison's crimes extended beyond simple theft. The illegal surveillance she had conducted on employees violated federal privacy laws, and her blackmail activities constituted additional felony charges. Most seriously, her plan to frame David Richardson for her crimes represented conspiracy and obstruction of justice charges that would add years to her potential prison sentence. At 3 a.m, Madison's attorney arrived and attempted to negotiate a plea bargain that would reduce her potential sentence in exchange for cooperation with federal investigators. But Agent Walsh made it clear that the evidence against Madison was so overwhelming that prosecutors would seek the maximum penalties for her crimes. "Your client orchestrated a sophisticated criminal enterprise that victimized clients, employees, and colleagues," Agent Walsh told Madison's attorney. "The evidence includes recorded confessions, documented financial fraud, and clear intent to frame innocent people for her crimes. The federal prosecutor will be seeking significant prison time." Madison's final act of desperation came when she attempted to claim that her confession about framing David Richardson had been coerced by my illegal surveillance activities. She argued that any evidence I had gathered as a custodial employee should be inadmissible because I had exceeded my authority and violated her privacy rights. But Agent Walsh had anticipated this defense strategy and was prepared with a revelation that stunned everyone in the room. Ms. Thompson's investigation was conducted under the authority of a federal investigation that has been ongoing for 3 months, she announced. We received anonymous tips about financial irregularities at Blackstone and Associates and placed Ms. Thompson in an undercover position to gather evidence. I stared at Agent Walsh in shock, realizing that my custodial job had been more than just a desperate attempt to pay rent while looking for work in my field. The FBI had been investigating Madison's criminal activities based on reports from her previous victims, and my hire at Pacific Cleaning Services had been facilitated to place someone with the proper educational background in a position to document her crimes. Every piece of evidence Ms. Thompson gathered was obtained under the authority of federal surveillance guidelines, Agent Walsh continued. Her recordings and document analysis constitute legally admissible evidence that will support federal prosecution of all individuals involved in this criminal conspiracy. Madison's face went completely white as she realized that her entire criminal operation had been under federal investigation long before she became aware of any threat. Her attempt to frame me for drug possession had actually been an assault on a federal agent conducting an authorized undercover operation. The final irony of Madison's downfall was that her own arrogance and cruelty had provided the evidence needed to ensure her conviction. If she had simply ignored me as an insignificant janitor, she might have continued her criminal activities indefinitely. Instead, her decision to mock and humiliate someone she perceived as powerless had placed her under surveillance by someone who possessed the exact skills needed to understand and document her crimes. As dawn broke over Seattle, Madison Brooks was led away in federal custody facing charges that would result in decades in prison. Her criminal empire had been completely dismantled, her victims had been protected, and justice was finally being served for the hundreds of thousands of dollars she had stolen and the innocent lives she had tried to destroy. 6 months later, I stood in the federal courthouse in Seattle as Judge Patricia Hendricks sentenced Madison Brooks to 12 years in federal prison for embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The woman who had once mocked me as a powerless janitor now wore an orange jumpsuit and shackles as she faced the consequences of her crimes. Ms. Brooks, your criminal enterprise demonstrated a level of sophistication and callousness that warrants significant punishment, Judge Hendricks declared as she imposed the sentence. You not only stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from trusting clients, but also attempted to destroy innocent people's lives to cover your tracks. Madison's accomplice, Marcus Webb, had already been sentenced to 8 years in prison for his role in manipulating audit reports and facilitating the money laundering scheme. The corrupt security personnel who had accepted bribes were facing their own criminal charges, and the entire network of fake businesses Madison had created to hide her theft had been dismantled by federal investigators. The courtroom was filled with Madison's victims, including David Richardson, Sarah Miller, and representatives from the client companies she had robbed. Watching their relief as justice was finally served provided a profound sense of closure after months of investigation testimony and legal proceedings. David Richardson had been completely exonerated and promoted to executive vice president at Blackstone and Associates with a substantial salary increase that ensured his daughter Emma could receive the best possible medical care. His reputation in the financial industry had been not only restored, but enhanced by his dignified handling of the false accusations that Madison had prepared against him. I can never adequately thank Erica for saving my life and my family's future, David said after the sentencing. Madison's plan would have sent me to prison and destroyed everything I've worked for over 20 years. Emma would have lost access to her medical treatments, and my wife would have been left to raise our children alone while I served time for crimes I never committed. Sarah Miller had completed her internship and been offered a permanent position as a junior accountant with Blackstone's new ethics compliance division. The traumatic experience of being coerced into processing fraudulent documents had motivated her to specialize in detecting and preventing financial crimes that exploit vulnerable employees. Madison taught me that criminals often target people who feel powerless or desperate, Sarah reflected. Now, I want to help protect other young professionals from being manipulated into participating in activities that could destroy their futures. The client companies that had been robbed by Madison's scheme recovered their stolen funds through federal asset forfeiture proceedings. Pinnacle Tech Morrison Industries and Coastal Retail Group also received additional compensation from Blackstone and Associates insurance policies and had their future marketing contracts restructured with enhanced oversight provisions. As for myself, the FBI's revelation that I had been working undercover had led to an offer to join their white-collar crime division as a special agent with expertise in financial fraud investigation. But I had chosen a different path that felt more personally meaningful. Blackstone and Associates had created a new position for me as Chief Ethics Officer, responsible for developing policies and procedures to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that Madison had perpetrated. My unique experience as both a victim and investigator of workplace crimes provided insights that were invaluable in designing protection systems for employees at all levels. The most important lesson I learned is that criminals like Madison succeed by convincing their victims that they're powerless. I explained to the ethics training seminars I now conducted for companies throughout the Pacific Northwest. She targeted David Richardson because his daughter's medical needs made him seem desperate. She exploited Sarah Miller because her student loans made her feel financially vulnerable. She assumed she could destroy me because my custodial uniform made her think I was insignificant. My story had become a case study in business schools and law enforcement academies, demonstrating how financial crimes often involve psychological manipulation and the systematic exploitation of power imbalances in workplace environments. The techniques Madison had used were being taught to future investigators as examples of how sophisticated criminals operate in corporate settings. But beyond the professional recognition and career advancement, the most satisfying outcome was the transformation of Blackstone and Associates into a workplace that truly protected and valued all employees. The new ethics policies I had developed included anonymous reporting systems, regular financial audits, and strict consequences for any form of employee intimidation or coercion. Every person in this organization deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their position or background. I told new employees during orientation sessions, whether you're an intern, a custodian, or an executive, your voice matters and your rights will be protected. The conference room where Madison had once humiliated me now hosted monthly meetings where employees could raise concerns about ethical issues without fear of retaliation. The corner office where she had conducted her criminal activities had been converted into a resource center where workers could access legal advice, financial counseling, and career development support. Standing in that transformed space, I often reflected on the irony of how Madison's attempt to make me feel powerless had ultimately revealed the true source of power in any organization, the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it seems impossible to succeed. The young woman who had cleaned Madison's office in silence while enduring verbal abuse had evolved into someone who could protect others from similar treatment. The custodial uniform I had worn with shame had taught me that a person's value isn't determined by their job title or social status, but by their integrity and willingness to fight for justice. Madison Brooks had mocked me for being a janitor, unaware that she was speaking to someone who would ultimately clean up the corruption she had spread throughout the organization. Her assumption that I was powerless had blinded her to the threat I represented, and her cruelty had motivated me to ensure that justice would be served. In the end, the woman who thought she was untouchable because of her position and influence learned that true power belongs to those who use it to protect rather than exploit others. Madison's career had crumbled not because of bad luck or external forces, but because her own actions had created the conditions for her downfall. The most profound lesson I took from this experience was that every person has the capacity to make a difference regardless of how powerless they might seem in the moment. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by people wearing uniforms that others don't notice, working shifts that others don't value, and possessing knowledge that others underestimate. Justice isn't always delivered by people in positions of obvious authority. Sometimes it comes from someone pushing a cleaning cart through empty hallways at midnight, observing everything and remembering every detail until the moment comes to speak truth to power. Have you ever witnessed workplace injustice and wondered whether one person could really make a difference in fighting corruption? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about how we can better support employees who see wrongdoing in their organizations. Please like this video if it inspired you to believe that everyone has the power to stand up for what's right. Subscribe for more stories about justice prevailing over abuse, and share this with anyone who needs to know that their voice matters no matter what position they hold. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one others overlook. May you always have the courage to do what's right, even when it feels impossible, and may justice find its way to every workplace where good people refuse to stay silent in the face of corruption.